I took the security guard job at a vacant hospital in Cleveland after being out of work for 6 months. The place was called St. Helena Medical Center, and it had been shut down for almost a decade. My supervisor, a guy named Marvin, said they needed someone to watch over it at night because copper thieves and vandals kept breaking in. I didn't know much about hospital security, but the idea of being alone in a massive, abandoned building all night didn't bother me at first. I'd worked plenty of night shifts before, and I liked the quiet. It seemed easy enough, just me, a flashlight, and a few rounds every couple of hours. On my first night, Marvin met me in the small security office just off the main lobby. The lobby itself looked like something out of a movie. Dusty, dimly lit, with peeling paint on the walls and a cracked check-in desk that hadn't seen a patient in years. Marvin handed me a walkie-talkie, a key ring that looked like it belonged to a medieval jailer, and a clipboard with the patrol schedule. "You'll be fine," he said. "The power cuts off around 10 in the old wings, but the generators keep this office and the west corridor lit. Most of the building's just dead space. You won't see anyone after I leave." He smiled, but there was something behind his eyes that made me uneasy. Before leaving, he added, "If you hear anything weird, don't go looking for it in the basement. Just call me." I laughed awkwardly, thinking he was joking, but he didn't laugh back. He just patted my shoulder and said, "Good luck, man," before walking out. By 11 o'clock, the whole place had gone silent. The only sounds were the hum of the generator and the occasional creak of old pipes shifting in the walls. My rounds took me through long hallways where hospital beds and equipment sat abandoned, yes, covered in sheets. The emergency lights cast everything in a sickly red glow that made the shadows feel alive. During my first patrol, I noticed the smell. Hospitals always have a distinct odor, antiseptic, metal, maybe a hint of bleach. But this one smelled different, like damp paper and rust mixed with something sour. It was strongest near the east wing, which had been closed off. The door to that area was padlocked, but I swore I heard something faint behind it, a rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking slowly from the other side. I told myself it was the wind, or pipes, or rats. That's what I kept thinking. Around midnight, I sat back down in the security office and poured myself a cup of burnt coffee from the machine Marvin left. The camera monitor was ancient. Only 4 feeds worked, and they flickered constantly. I watched the grainy images cycle through the empty halls. For a long while, nothing moved. Then, on the far left feed, I saw something shift. It was a dark shape near the entrance to the pediatric ward. I leaned closer. The figure moved past the edge of the camera, slow but deliberate. It looked human, maybe wearing something white. I grabbed the walkie and pressed the button, trying to reach Marvin. All I got was static. I hesitated before heading out. Maybe a vagrant had gotten inside. I'd seen worse on other jobs. I took my flashlight and started toward the pediatric wing. The air grew colder as I went, and that sour smell came back stronger. My boots echoed through the empty hall. When I turned the last corner, I saw the double doors to pediatrics swinging gently open, even though they had been shut earlier. "Hello?" I called out, my voice bouncing off the tiled walls. "Security, you're not supposed to be in here." No response. I stepped through the doors. The beam of my flashlight swept across faded murals of cartoon animals and broken toys scattered on the floor. The air felt heavy. As I moved further in, I thought I heard faint laughter. It wasn't close, more like it came from deep down the corridor, high-pitched, almost like a child's. I froze. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave. But part of me needed to make sure no one was actually in there. I followed the sound to the nurse's station. The counter was covered in old paperwork and empty pill bottles. My light passed over a cracked mirror, and for a split second, I thought I saw someone standing behind me. I spun around. Nothing. Then, from the far room, I heard a whisper. It was a voice. Soft. Indistinct. "Help me." I stepped closer, my heart thudding. The room it came from used to be the playroom. I could tell by the faded paintings on the walls, balloons, smiling suns, cheerful faces that looked grotesque now under the flashlight's beam. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was empty except for a few overturned chairs. "Hello?" I said again, my voice trembling. Something cold brushed past my arm. I whipped around, shining the light everywhere. Nothing. But the temperature had dropped so suddenly that I could see my breath. I backed out, walking fast, not running, telling myself I was just freaking out. On my way out of the wing, I noticed that the swinging doors had stopped moving. They were still. When I got back to the office, I locked the door behind me. The monitors were still flickering, but now every single feed showed static for a few seconds. Then one camera, the one facing the lobby, came back online. There was someone standing there. They were facing the front doors, wearing a hospital gown. I watched as the person slowly turned toward the camera. Their face was pale and expressionless. Then, in a single frame, they were gone. I stayed in the office until dawn. I didn't move. When Marvin showed up at 6, I told him what I saw. He didn't seem surprised. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You're not the first one." He leaned against the doorway and lit a cigarette. That hospital shut down after the fire in 2007. Pediatrics was hit the worst. The sprinklers failed and a few kids didn't make it. Nobody talks about it anymore. I stared at him. "And you didn't think to mention that before hiring me?" He exhaled smoke slowly. "If I told you that, would you have taken the job?" I didn't answer. I worked there for 2 more nights before quitting. On my last shift, around 3 in the morning, I heard the same laughter echoing down the halls. But this time, I didn't go looking for it. I just turned off the radio, sat in the corner of the office, and waited for sunrise. When I clocked out that morning, I swore I'd never set foot in that building again. A few weeks later, I got curious and drove past St. Helena again. The city had fenced it off by then, and there was a demolition notice posted at the gate. As I sat there watching the empty structure, one of the upper windows flickered. For a moment, I could swear I saw a small hand pressed against the glass. Then it was gone. I drove away without looking back. Story the end. I took the security job at the old Harker Distribution Center in rural Illinois after months of unemployment. The place sat on the edge of town, surrounded by overgrown fields and a long stretch of cracked asphalt that hadn't been maintained in decades. It used to be a major shipping hub in the late 80s, but after the company moved operations to a bigger city, the facility was left mostly abandoned. By the time I started there in 2019, only one section of the building was in use. A small warehouse leased out by a local contractor who stored construction equipment and surplus materials. The rest of the complex was dark, empty, and silent. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., 5 nights a week. The job seemed easy enough at first. The company that hired me, Cobalt Security, gave me a basic uniform, a flashlight, a radio, and an old Ford Escape to use for perimeter checks. They told me I'd mostly just be watching cameras and doing rounds, making sure no one broke in or vandalized the property. There were reports of teens sneaking into abandoned parts of the warehouse to drink or film videos, so my main job was to keep them out. It sounded boring, but that's what I wanted, something quiet. The first few nights were exactly that. I sat in the small security office at the edge of the warehouse, a windowless room with flickering fluorescent lights and a faint smell of mold, watching grainy black and white footage of the building's empty corridors. The place was huge, over 400,000 square feet, with miles of shelving, loading docks, and empty offices. My rounds took about 45 minutes if I walked the whole thing. I usually did 2 patrols per night, one around midnight and another around 3 a.m. It was during my second week that things started to feel off. It began one quiet Wednesday. I was about halfway through my shift when I noticed movement on camera 14. The one pointed down the north loading bay hallway, a long stretch of concrete lined with 10 massive doors. I saw what looked like a figure walk past the far end of the corridor. Just a flicker of movement, but enough to catch my eye. I leaned closer to the monitor, rewound the footage, and there it was again, a shadowy shape moving from left to right. I grabbed my flashlight and radio and went to check it out. The building was freezing that night. My breath came out in thin clouds as I walked the hallway. The sound of my boots echoed against the walls. I scanned each loading bay door. All were locked and secured with heavy chains. The only light came from the motion-activated lamps flickering overhead. I reached the far end of the corridor where the camera had caught the movement, but there was nothing there, just a row of old pallets and dust-covered crates. I stood there for a moment, listening. The building had a strange way of amplifying sound. You could hear your own breathing echo back at you. Just as I was about to turn around, I heard something faint, a slow creak, like metal being gently twisted. It came from somewhere behind one of the closed loading doors. I tried the handle. Locked. I put my ear against the steel. Silence. I told myself it was probably the wind or shifting metal and went back to the office. The footage didn't show anything else for the rest of the night, but the unease stuck with me. By the third week, I started noticing small changes during my patrols. Doors that I knew I had locked earlier would sometimes be open when I passed again. Light switches would be on in rooms I hadn't entered. Once, the elevator at the center of the complex, which hadn't worked in years, was sitting on the ground floor with the doors wide open. I asked my supervisor, a guy named Randy, if anyone else came by during my shift, maybe cleaners or maintenance workers. He said no. I was supposed to be the only one on site between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. Old buildings make noises, Randy said. Don't let it mess with your head. You'll start seeing things if you do. That advice stuck with me, but it didn't stop the weirdness. One night, around 1 a.m., I heard a loud banging sound coming from the east wing. It was rhythmic, like someone was hitting a pipe with a wrench. When I reached the corridor, the sound stopped. I swept my flashlight down the hall. The beam caught something wet and shiny on the floor, a trail of dark liquid leading toward the stairwell. I thought maybe an animal had gotten inside, so I followed it. The trail went down the stairs, but when I reached the lower level, it abruptly ended. There was nothing there. No footprints, no body, nothing. The next morning, when the day supervisor arrived, I asked if there were any leaks or plumbing issues in that area. He looked at me strangely. That section doesn't have running water anymore, he said. After that, I started keeping notes in a small pocket notebook. Times, camera numbers, sounds I couldn't explain. I didn't want to sound crazy, but I needed some way to prove to myself that it wasn't all in my head. About a month in, everything escalated. It was a Friday night, early March. I remember because it had been snowing heavily. I drove through nearly 6 inches of slush just to get there. The power flickered a few times before midnight, and I could hear the wind howling through cracks in the loading dock doors. Around 12:30 a.m., I was watching the cameras when I saw something that made my stomach twist. On camera 19, the one covering the second floor offices, there was a man standing at the end of the hallway. He was tall, thin, wearing what looked like a long coat. I couldn't make out his face. I froze, staring at the screen. The hallway where he stood was supposed to be locked off. The upper floors had been condemned due to roof damage. I picked up the radio and called it in, but there was only static. My phone had no service either. The snowstorm had knocked out the signal, so I grabbed my flashlight and went to check. The stairwell to the second floor smelled like damp insulation. My boots left prints in the dust. I reached the top and swept my light down the hall. The air was colder up there, the kind of chill that sinks into your bones. The corridor stretched about 50 feet, lined with empty office doors. My light flickered as I walked. "Security," I called out. My voice echoed back, slightly distorted. "If someone's up here, you need to leave the building." Nothing. I kept moving, checking each office one by one. Empty. Just old desks and cracked windows. When I reached the end of the hall, I saw something strange. The door to the last office was ajar, and there were handprints on the glass. Large ones, smeared across like someone had pressed hard from the inside. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was pitch dark. My flashlight cut across the walls, peeling paint, broken blinds, an old filing cabinet. Then, in the far corner, I saw movement. A shadow pulled back into the darkness, like someone stepping away from the light. "Hey," I shouted. "You can't be in here." No response. I stepped closer. The air felt thick, almost heavy. I could hear faint breathing, or maybe I imagined it. I aimed the flashlight directly at the corner. Nothing there. Just dust floating in the beam. Then the door slammed behind me. I spun around and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. It felt like someone was holding it from the other side. I kicked it hard, once, twice. The third time, it flew open. I stumbled out into the hall, my heart pounding. The lights overhead flickered, and for a split second I saw something at the far end. That same tall figure, watching me. I ran. When I got back to the office, I rewound the camera footage. What I saw didn't make sense. The man on the monitor never moved. He just stood there the entire time, even after I'd gone up. And then at exactly 12:57 a.m., he vanished. Not walked away, not faded, just disappeared between one frame and the next. I sent the footage to Randy the next morning. He called me 2 hours later, angry. "Don't mess around with me, man," he said. "You edited that or something?" "I swear I didn't," I said. "Check the timestamps." He sighed. "That floor's been sealed for years. There's nobody up there." I could tell he didn't believe me, but he also didn't fire me. I think part of him was just curious to see if I'd keep showing up. I did. But things only got worse. A week later, I was doing my 3 a.m. round when I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me. I turned around. Nothing. I walked faster. The sound followed. It was like someone matching my pace. I stopped. So did the steps. I called out again. Silence. Then I heard whispering. Faint. Distant. Like multiple voices blending together. I couldn't make out words. I started backing toward the stairwell when a loud crash echoed down the hall. A metal shelf had toppled over in one of the storage rooms. I pointed my flashlight inside. The shelf was lying flat on the floor, but there was nothing else there. I felt this overwhelming sense that someone was standing just behind me. When I turned, my flashlight flickered out. For maybe 10 seconds, I stood in total darkness. My ears rang with silence. Then, right next to me, I heard a low whisper. Just 2 words. "Don't look." I bolted out of there and didn't stop running until I reached the security office. I didn't tell Randy that part. I didn't tell anyone. By the end of that month, I was barely sleeping. I'd started leaving all the lights on during my shift and kept the radio volume high just to have some noise. Every creak and groan of the building made me jump. But quitting wasn't an option. I needed the paycheck, and I kept convincing myself there had to be a logical explanation for everything. One night, near the end of April, I finally got an answer, though not one I wanted. The storm had knocked out part of the power grid again, and I was sitting in the office with the backup generator humming. Around 2:15 a.m., the monitors started flickering between camera feeds. One of them, camera 7, showed the loading dock hallway, but it wasn't empty. A man in a long coat was walking slowly toward the camera. Same one I'd seen before. Only this time his face was visible, or what was left of it. It looked burned. Patches of blackened skin, one eye swollen shut, the other reflecting light like glass. His jaw seemed dislocated, hanging slightly to one side. He moved in short, jerky steps like his legs didn't bend properly. I watched in frozen horror as he reached the end of the hall and stopped, staring directly into the camera. Then the feed went black. The generator sputtered and died. The lights went out. I sat there in pitch darkness, my pulse hammering in my throat. I could hear the wind rattling outside, and then something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing just outside the office door. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the door. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, from the other side, I heard that same rasping whisper. "Don't look." The doorknob started to turn, creaking slowly. I backed away until my back hit the far wall. Then the lights flickered back on. The door was wide open, but there was no one there. I walked out into the hallway, flashlight shaking in my hand. Every instinct told me to run, but I had to know. I followed the corridor to the loading bay, but it was empty. No footprints, no sign of anyone. When I got back to the office, all the camera feeds were back to normal, except one, camera 7. The screen showed static, and behind the static for just a moment, I saw that burned face staring out. I quit the next morning. A few weeks later, I ran into a former coworker who had worked security there years before me. When I told him what happened, he went pale. "You saw him too," he said quietly. "That place, someone died there, back in the 90s. A worker got trapped in one of the freight elevators during a fire. They never found the body. After that, people started seeing things. Everyone who's worked that night shift eventually quits." I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know. Even now, years later, I still dream about that building. Sometimes in the dream, I'm back in the hallway, flashlight shaking, watching that burned face step out from the shadows. Other times, I'm sitting in front of the monitor, and the camera turns itself on. And every single time, before I wake up, I hear that whisper again, right behind me. "Don't look." Story the end. It was just past midnight when I started my shift at the old industrial complex on the outskirts of Detroit. I'd been working security for nearly 5 years by then, mostly night shifts at warehouses and small factories, and I thought I'd seen it all. But nothing could have prepared me for what that night had in store. The complex was mostly abandoned now. A few companies still rented space, but the main building, a hulking, rusting structure from the 1940s, had been empty for almost a decade. My job was simple: patrol the property, make sure no one was trespassing, and check the surveillance cameras in the main office. The night started like any other. I arrived around 11:50 p.m., my uniform crisp, flashlight charged, and my patrol log in hand. I walked through the main gate, its hinges groaning under the weight of years, and headed toward the security office. The building itself was unheated and drafty, the old wiring sparking occasionally above the ceiling tiles. I flipped on the lights, checked my radios, and logged in. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That is, until around 12:30 a.m. when the motion sensors by the east loading dock went off. At first, I shrugged it off. It was probably a stray raccoon or some neighborhood cat. But as I approached the cameras near the dock, I noticed movement that didn't belong. A shadow, tall and thin, slipping behind a stack of old pallets. My stomach sank. Trespassers weren't unusual, but what unsettled me was the way it moved. Too smooth, almost gliding. I grabbed my flashlight and headed outside. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the scent of rust and decay. My boots crunched over the gravel, and my flashlight's beam cut through the darkness, but I found nothing. No pallets moved, no signs of anyone having been there. I checked the camera feed again. The shadow was gone. I shook my head. Must be a glitch, I muttered to myself, trying to ignore the chill running down my spine. I continued my patrol, making the rounds through the deserted hallways. The air inside the factory smelled like old machinery and mildew. Every step echoed off the concrete walls. I noticed the doors that should have been locked were sometimes slightly ajar, even though I remembered checking them earlier. My heart started to beat faster. I told myself it was my imagination, the nerves getting to me during a quiet night shift. Around 1:15 a.m., I got a radio call from another guard, Tim, who worked at a smaller annex building nearby. "Hey man, you seeing this on the cameras?" "I don't like it." His voice was shaky. I hurried over to his office on the monitors. On one of the feeds, a figure in dark clothing was walking along the catwalk above the main floor. The person moved unnaturally, their limbs slightly elongated, and they didn't cast a shadow. I rubbed my eyes. "Tim? That's impossible," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We watched for a few minutes. The figure climbed down a metal ladder, disappearing from camera view. Tim and I both grabbed our flashlights and met near the main entrance. "We're checking it out," I said. As soon as we stepped into the hallway, the temperature dropped noticeably. My breath fogged in front of me. Every metal surface seemed to hum faintly, vibrating under my touch. I tried to calm myself, blaming the old HVAC system, but Tim looked pale, his hand gripping his flashlight so tightly it trembled. We made our way to the ladder leading up to the catwalk. The figure wasn't there, but the metal steps were cold, slick as if wet. I felt a sense of dread I couldn't explain. Tim whispered, "Do you feel that? Like, we're not alone?" I nodded, even though I hated admitting fear. That's when I heard it, a scraping sound from the far end of the hall, slow and deliberate. It wasn't footsteps, it was something dragging, but it was too heavy to be human. I shined my flashlight toward the noise. Nothing. The beam cut through darkness thick enough to choke on, but there was no one there. We continued cautiously, scanning every corner. Then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It wasn't the same shadow we'd seen on the cameras. This one was closer, and its movements were wrong, jerky, almost glitching, like a video feed skipping. Its face was obscured by a hood, but I felt its eyes on me. And then a low hiss, almost a whisper, reached my ears. "Why are you here?" Tim froze. I stepped forward. "We're security. We're supposed to." I stopped mid-sentence. My voice had been swallowed by the darkness. The figure vanished before my eyes. The hall was empty, silent except for our ragged breathing. We didn't speak for a moment. The old building groaned as if it were alive, the pipes rattling above us. Tim finally broke the silence. "We need to get out. Now." I agreed, my instincts screaming. We turned back toward the stairs, but the layout had changed. The walls seemed to stretch farther than they should, corridors twisting in impossible angles. I felt panic rising. We were lost. Every hallway looked the same. Every door led to another shadowed room. My radio buzzed, but there was no one on the other end. Only static, like a whispering wind carrying voices we shouldn't hear. I thought about calling the police, but even dialing felt wrong. The numbers on the keypad looked distorted, like someone had smeared them. I tried to speak to Tim, but he was staring at a wall, his eyes wide. "Do you see it?" he whispered. I looked. At first, it was just shadows. Then slowly, forms began to emerge. Faces pale and distorted, pressed against the walls from the inside. Lips moving, whispering words I couldn't understand. My stomach churned, and I turned away, but they were everywhere. The hallways were alive, breathing, watching. I grabbed Tim's arm and ran. We sprinted through the endless corridors, heartbeats pounding like war drums. Doors slammed shut behind us, and when I glanced back, I thought I saw the hooded figure following, but every time I turned, there was nothing. We stumbled into what looked like the main lobby, the grand hall that had once been the reception area. It was dark, broken, and smelled of decay. The front door was in sight. Relief surged through me until I reached for the handle. It was ice cold. The door wouldn't budge. Behind me, the shadows started moving. Fast now, swirling, creeping along the floor, up the walls, forming shapes that defied explanation. Tim screamed, a sound raw and primal, and I grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the windows. But they were barred, the glass frosted and opaque. The shadows seemed to respond to our panic, gathering, twisting into figures with hollow eyes and mouths that opened impossibly wide, hissing and whispering at once. We ran to the elevator shaft, hoping for another exit. The elevator doors opened as if welcoming us, but the cab was dark, empty, and smelled of rot. Without thinking, we jumped in. The doors closed, and the shaft plunged into darkness. The lights flickered on and off, revealing glimpses of faces pressed against the elevator walls, faces familiar and unfamiliar, some screaming, some silent. My flashlight flickered, then died. In that moment, the world felt wrong, as if reality itself was bending, reshaping around the building. When the elevator finally stopped, we stumbled out into an unfamiliar basement. Pipes hung low, water pooled on the concrete floor, and the air was thick and choking. The shadows were gone, but a new sound replaced them, a whispering chorus, just beyond comprehension. We pressed forward, crawling through the tight passages, our flashlights useless. Every step felt like wading through molasses. The building seemed endless, a labyrinth designed to trap us forever. Hours, or maybe minutes passed. Time didn't make sense. Eventually, we found a stairwell leading up. We climbed, exhausted, and broke through a door into the night air. I gasped, filling my lungs with cold, crisp air. The parking lot was empty, normal. The night sky stretched above us. Relief was overwhelming. We ran to my patrol car, jumped in, and drove off the property, not stopping until the city lights of Detroit were visible in the distance. The next day, I went back with the police. The building was completely abandoned, empty, and structurally sound. There were no signs of break-ins, no footprints, no traces of Tim and me being trapped inside. Security footage showed only us walking through empty corridors, the cameras capturing nothing of the figures or shadows we'd seen. Even the other guards insisted nothing unusual had happened. The building was silent, normal, lifeless. I never worked a night shift there again. Tim quit his job shortly after. We both suffered nightmares for months, waking up in cold sweats, the whispers still echoing in our minds. Sometimes I wonder if we'd really escaped, or if that building had only let us leave a fragment of ourselves behind. Every time I drive past that complex now, I can't help but look, expecting to see something moving in the shadows, something waiting for the next shift. Years later, I heard a rumor from another guard who'd been hired after us. He mentioned hearing voices, seeing figures in the halls, and doors that led nowhere. I didn't need confirmation. Some places, I realized, aren't abandoned. They're awake. And some of us are only allowed to leave because the building decides it's time. Not everyone makes it out intact. I still remember that first figure on the camera, gliding behind the pallets. Its movements were wrong, unnatural. I thought it was a person, but now I know it wasn't. And when I think back to the whispers in the basement, the walls closing in, the faces pressed against every surface, I understand something I wish I didn't. Some buildings aren't structures. They're predators. And security guards like me, they're just prey wearing uniforms, walking into the lair, thinking we're safe. The night shift taught me that lesson the hard way. I never saw the building again after leaving Detroit, but every now and then, in the middle of another late-night shift somewhere else, I'll feel a chill, hear faint whispers, or see shadows flicker at the corner of my eye. And I know, somewhere out there, that place is still waiting, still hungry, still watching. No camera, no alarm, no patrol can stop it. Not really. And it will always find a way to let you know you were never truly alone. Story the end. It was the winter of 2018 when I started my new job as a night security guard at a massive office building in downtown Chicago. The place was called the Westbrook Tower, a 40-story glass and steel structure that used to house a few major law firms and investment companies. But by then, most of the tenants had moved out, either relocated or shut down, leaving only a handful of floors occupied. My job was to monitor the building overnight from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., making sure no one broke in, checking the camera feeds, and logging hourly patrols through the empty corridors. The first few nights were uneventful. The building's heating system kept the halls eerily warm, even though most offices were unoccupied. The lights in the lobby stayed on all night, and the faint hum of the vending machines filled the silence. The security office was on the first floor, tucked behind the main reception desk, with monitors showing feeds from cameras placed on every floor, hallway, and exit. My partner, an older guy named Derek, worked the day shift. We'd exchange brief updates at the start and end of each day, but I mostly worked alone. It was my fourth night when things started to feel off. I was doing my usual round, taking the elevator up to the 25th floor, walking the halls, checking the stairwells. The 25th was completely vacant, its offices stripped bare, desks and cubicles removed long ago. The floor smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and dust. I remember walking past a large conference room with floor-to-ceiling glass walls. As I passed, something in the reflection caught my eye, a movement behind me. When I turned around, there was no one there. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just my shadow or the flickering of the lights. Still, the feeling of being watched stayed with me. When I got back to the security office, I reviewed the camera feeds out of curiosity. That's when I noticed something strange. On the monitor for the 25th floor hallway, where I'd just been, I saw what looked like a faint figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't solid, more like a smudge or a distortion in the image, shaped vaguely like a person. I leaned closer, adjusting the contrast. The figure didn't move, but I could swear it was facing the camera. I blinked, and suddenly, it was gone. I rewound the footage, but the figure didn't appear again. The feed just showed an empty hallway. I told myself it was a glitch in the camera. Those old analog systems always had static or interference. By midnight, I was on the 30th floor, logging my next patrol. The 30th was partially occupied. One small accounting firm kept their offices there, but they were closed for the week. I checked each office door, all locked, lights off. But when I passed by the break room, I noticed something strange. The coffee pot was on. It was bubbling faintly, a fresh pot half full. I knew for a fact no one had been there that day. Derek had mentioned the floor was clear. I unplugged it, uneasy. As I turned to leave, a faint sound echoed down the hallway. Footsteps. They were soft, measured, coming from the far end of the corridor. I froze. "Hello?" I called out. No response. The footsteps stopped, then resumed, closer now. My heart started pounding. I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam illuminated nothing except dust motes drifting in the air. "This is private property," I said firmly, stepping forward. The footsteps stopped again. Silence. Then, faintly, I heard a whisper, low and drawn out, coming from just around the corner. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was distant but clear, like someone speaking from inside a vent. My breath caught in my throat. "Who's there?" I demanded, shining my light toward the corner. No one. The hallway was empty. I backed away slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. By the time I reached the elevator, the lights above me began to flicker. I pressed the down button repeatedly. The doors opened with a chime, and I stepped inside, exhaling shakily. As the elevator doors slid shut, I glanced up and froze. For a split second, I saw a figure reflected in the polished steel of the door behind me. Tall, thin, standing perfectly still in the hallway. Then the doors closed, cutting off my view. I returned to the security office and immediately checked the camera feeds for the 30th floor. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I checked the timestamps, rewound 5 minutes, 10 minutes, still nothing. The cameras hadn't recorded anyone but me. I sat there for a long moment trying to calm myself. I even laughed nervously, convincing myself it was fatigue. The graveyard shift did strange things to the mind. At around 2:45 a.m., the elevator alarm went off. Someone had hit the emergency stop button between floors. I pulled up the elevator camera. The feed was dark at first, static flickering. Then the image cleared. The elevator was empty, but the emergency button light was on, glowing red. I reset the system remotely, and the elevator resumed moving. Still, the thought of that alarm going off on its own made me uneasy. The next night, I brought a thermos of coffee and tried to shake off the nerves. Everything was normal until about 3:10 a.m. I was watching the monitors when one of the cameras on the 18th floor started glitching. The image distorted, colors bleeding together like static interference. Then, faintly, the shape of a person appeared again. Same height, same posture as the figure I'd seen before. They were standing at the end of the hall, unmoving. I zoomed in, but the closer I looked, the more distorted the image became. And then, in a flash of static, the figure was gone again. I decided to check it out in person. The elevator ride up felt like it took forever. When I stepped onto the 18th floor, the air was cold, far colder than any other floor. My breath fogged in front of me. The hallway lights flickered intermittently, casting long, trembling shadows. I walked carefully, flashlight in hand, my boots echoing on the tile. As I reached the end of the hall, I noticed a door slightly open. Room 1803. That door should have been locked. I'd checked it earlier that evening. I nudged it open and stepped inside. The room was empty except for a few discarded office chairs and a broken printer. The windows were sealed shut. I scanned the room with my flashlight, about to turn back when I saw something etched into the far wall, letters scratched into the paint. At first, I thought it was graffiti, but the words were precise, deliberate. It's still here. A chill ran through me. I stepped back, heart pounding. That's when the lights went out. The entire floor plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then went out completely. I was left standing in pitch black, my breath echoing in the silence. I reached for my radio, but all I got was static. Then somewhere behind me, I heard a slow, dragging sound like something heavy being pulled across the floor. I turned, trying to see through the dark, but there was nothing. The dragging sound grew louder, closer, accompanied by faint whispers, hundreds of them, overlapping, unintelligible. I felt the air shift behind me, cold breath brushing the back of my neck. I ran. I didn't care about protocol or logs. I sprinted to the elevator, slamming the button repeatedly. The doors opened just as something clattered in the dark behind me, like metal scraping tile. I jumped inside and hit the first floor button. As the doors began to close, I saw movement at the end of the hall. The same tall figure from the cameras, only this time it was clearer. Its face was pale, almost featureless, like clay stretched too thin. It tilted its head slightly, as if watching me. Then the doors shut, and the elevator descended. When I got back to the security office, the power flickered back on. The cameras rebooted, all feeds normal again. I called Derek the next morning, told him what had happened. He laughed at first, said I was probably seeing things. But when he came in for his shift, I showed him the scratches on the wall from the 18th floor camera feed. The words were still there. He went upstairs later that day to check. When he came back down, he looked pale. "There's nothing there," he said quietly. "No writing, just blank paint." I knew he was lying. I could see it in his eyes. Something had scared him. That night, I went through the building records. I learned that a few years before I started, a janitor had fallen down an elevator shaft and died on the 18th floor. The accident report mentioned faulty wiring and elevator malfunctions, similar to the ones I'd been experiencing. But what caught my attention was the note in the final report. Unusual interference reported on security systems before incident. The next few weeks were tense. The strange events continued, doors unlocking on their own, motion sensors triggering with no one around, the sound of footsteps echoing through empty hallways. I tried to get reassigned, but the company was short-staffed. I needed the job, so I stayed. One night, around 3 a.m., I was sitting in the security office when all the cameras went black simultaneously. The monitors flickered, then one by one, each came back on except the 18th floor. That feed stayed dark. Then, in the silence, the elevator bell chimed. Once, twice. I checked the feed for the elevator. It was moving, descending slowly, but no one was inside. The elevator stopped at the lobby. I could hear the doors slide open from where I sat. My radio crackled softly, and through the static, I heard a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." The same voice as before. I froze, staring at the elevator down the hall. The lobby was empty, but I could see my reflection faintly in the polished floor. Behind me, in the reflection, stood the figure, tall, still, watching. I turned around instantly. Nothing. When I looked back at the reflection, it was gone. I quit the next morning. Derek didn't even ask why. He just nodded as if he already knew. A few months later, I heard that the building had finally been sold and was being renovated. During the renovation, workers reported tools disappearing, lights flickering, and cold drafts on the 18th floor. One worker claimed to have seen a man standing in the elevator shaft, staring up at him before vanishing. That building is still there, still operational. Sometimes I drive past it late at night. The top floors are dark, but every now and then I see one light flicker on, the 18th floor. I don't know if it's electrical problems or if that thing still roams the halls, waiting for the next unlucky guard to make their rounds. All I know is that something about that place wasn't right. It wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And I still hear that voice sometimes when I'm alone at night, half asleep. "You shouldn't be here." Story the end. The first night I walked into the security office, I thought I had a pretty decent handle on what I was getting myself into. I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in criminal justice, and I had spent the last year bouncing around temporary security gigs, mostly mall patrols and some corporate front desk work. This new gig was different. It wasn't flashy or prestigious. It was just me, a small security office, and the sprawling, mostly abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of Indianapolis. The sign outside read Westbrook Industrial Park, though it looked more like a graveyard for half-demolished warehouses than a place of business. The office itself was a metal shack sandwiched between two massive, dilapidated factory buildings. Inside, it smelled like burnt coffee and mildew. Flickering fluorescent lights hung overhead, casting the room in a half-dark gloom. The monitor bank sat on a scratched-up steel desk and a single phone corded to the wall. I noticed a set of handwritten instructions taped above the desk. "Report anything unusual. Don't leave the office unless absolutely necessary. If you see him, stay put and call the police." I remember thinking, huh? Who's him? I assumed it was some local troublemaker or urban legend thing. I laughed it off. The first week was uneventful. Most nights, I'd sit in the office, scanning the grainy CCTV feeds of empty warehouses and cracked asphalt parking lots. Sometimes the wind would howl through broken windows, making the camera feeds flicker like static. I didn't mind the solitude. It was quiet, and I liked quiet. But by the second week, things started to feel off. It began with the noises. At first, it was subtle. A scraping sound somewhere in Warehouse 3 at 2:17 a.m., the faint thump of something rolling across the concrete. Every time I checked the cameras, nothing was there. I'd shrug, muttering to myself, old buildings make old noises. But the scraping got louder over time. It became footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving from one warehouse to the next, always just out of camera range. I never saw anyone. One Thursday night, about 2 weeks in, I was walking the perimeter, part of the routine, though technically I wasn't supposed to leave the office unless necessary. I had a flashlight in one hand and my radio clipped to my vest. I checked Warehouse 5 and saw the door slightly ajar. I could swear I had locked it earlier. My heart started pounding, but I pushed forward. I tapped the door with the handle. Nothing. I shined the flashlight inside, beams cutting across rows of rusted machinery and debris. And then I saw it. A shadow. Just a figure standing in the corner. Tall, broad, and completely still. I froze. I wanted to call it in, but my radio felt heavy in my hand. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. No movement. No sound. I checked the feed on the camera. It showed only empty space, the door still closed. I forced myself to laugh, telling myself it was a trick of the light, maybe my imagination playing on the shadows. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The incidents escalated quickly after that, footsteps echoing behind me in hallways that were supposed to be abandoned. Doors creaking open and shut on their own. Sometimes I'd feel a cold draft on the back of my neck, like someone had walked past me. I tried telling myself it was just the old building settling, mice, or rats, but my gut told me otherwise. One night, around 3 a.m., I was monitoring the cameras when I noticed something strange. Warehouse 2, which had been empty all night, showed a figure moving between the crates. I grabbed my radio, calling the dispatch line. Dispatch, this is Officer Harris. I've got a possible trespasser in Warehouse 2. Requesting guidance. Silence. Then static. Then, check it yourself. It's your shift, man. I cursed under my breath and grabbed my flashlight. I approached the door cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. I opened it slowly, sweeping the beam of light across the warehouse. It was empty. But then I saw writing on the wall, fresh, scrawled in black, almost like someone had used grease or oil. I see you. My hands shook so badly I dropped the flashlight. When I bent down to pick it up, the beam caught something in the corner, a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me. I froze, heart hammering. Then a low, guttural chuckle echoed through the warehouse. I spun around, ready to run, but there was no one. Just the emptiness, broken crates, and that smell, like wet dirt and something rotten. I called the local police that night. They sent 2 officers, and we swept the warehouse. Nothing. No footprints, no evidence, no sign anyone had been there at all. Just the writing on the wall, which had disappeared by the time I looked again the next day. I started keeping a log after that, writing down every odd occurrence, every noise, every fleeting shadow. I called it my shift diary, though I doubted anyone would ever believe it. Then there were the phone calls. The office had a landline, and one night around 2:46 a.m. it rang. I picked it up, half expecting a prank. The line was silent. Then, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." My stomach turned. I slammed the receiver down, but it rang again 5 minutes later, and each time the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Leave, now." The worst incident came about a month into the job. I was in the office scanning the cameras when I noticed a figure moving in Warehouse 1. Not a shadow, not a trick of the camera. A man. Tall, wearing what looked like a dark coat. He was dragging something. I couldn't see clearly what it was, but it was large, like a body or a crate. I called dispatch. "There's definitely someone here. I'm going to confront them." They told me to stay in the office. I grabbed my flashlight anyway. I walked into the hallway leading to Warehouse 1, and the temperature dropped instantly. My breath came out in fog. The flashlight flickered, then went out. Total darkness. I fumbled with its light, finally getting a weak beam, and I swear I saw him standing at the far end of the hall, not moving, just watching. And the thing he was dragging was a person. No, a mannequin at first, but then it moved. Something alive, or maybe dead. I can't be sure. I ran back to the office, slammed the door, and locked it. I called the police. This time, they came fast. They brought flashlights and guns. When they swept the warehouses, there was no one. Nothing at all. No footprints, no signs of forced entry. Even the dragging marks were gone. I tried to explain what I had seen, but they looked at me like I was crazy. The paperwork I filed went nowhere. My supervisor told me to take a few nights off, maybe get some rest, which I took as a polite way of saying I was imagining things. I thought about quitting. I really did. But I needed the money, and I was stubborn. So I stayed, and the phenomena continued. Cameras would show fleeting figures that disappeared when I switched angles. Doors would slam. I would hear breathing when I was alone. And every night, just before dawn, a single shadow would appear outside the office window, motionless, watching. I never saw its face, but I always felt its eyes on me. After 3 months, I started carrying a small recording device with me. I wanted proof, something tangible I could show someone. One night, I set it on the desk, and it recorded everything. Footsteps, whispers, doors creaking, the low guttural chuckle. I played it back during the day, and the hairs on my arms stood up. There was something in the recording I hadn't noticed live. A voice, calm this time, almost conversational. "You belong here. You can't leave." That same night, around 4:13 a.m., I was walking the perimeter again, flashlight in hand. I was careful, looking behind every corner, checking every shadow. And then I saw him. Not a shadow this time. A man, tall, dressed in black, with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. He didn't move at first. He just stood there, watching. And then he started walking toward me. Slow, deliberate. I tried to call for help on the radio, but my voice caught in my throat. I turned and ran. I don't know how fast I ran, but I made it back to the office and locked the door. The figure stopped at the edge of the lot, standing still, watching through the windows. I could see his reflection in the glass, and then slowly he raised a hand and waved. A slow, deliberate wave. I quit the next morning. I didn't even take my paycheck. I left my security badge and keys on the desk. I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well and wouldn't be returning. I never went back. But here's the thing. Even months later, I drive past that industrial park and I swear I see him, standing near the edge of the lot, motionless, watching. And sometimes late at night, I swear I hear a whisper just behind me. You can't leave. I never told anyone the full truth about what happened. Most people would call me crazy. Maybe I am. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that Industrial Park is not empty. Whatever that thing was, it's still there, and it's waiting for the next night shift guard to show up alone in the dark. Even now, sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear scraping outside my window. My wife tells me it's just the house settling, but I can't help it. My heart races, because I know what it sounds like. I know what it means. And I know that no matter how far I go, there's a part of me that never left that industrial park. Story the end. I used to work security at a large manufacturing plant in Ohio. The facility was old, built sometime in the 1950s, and though the company had updated the machinery and safety systems, the bones of the place still felt ancient. It had that kind of history you could smell. Oil, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. My shift ran from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., the graveyard shift, the one nobody else wanted. At first, I didn't mind it. The pay was better, the quiet suited me, and most nights were routine. I'd start by checking all exterior doors, then do a walkthrough of the manufacturing floor, storage areas, and back offices. We had 24 security cameras around the property, all monitored from the control room in the front office. But after about 3 weeks on the job, I realized the building changed at night. It sounds strange, but it felt alive, like it was breathing in the dark. It started small. Motion sensors going off in empty hallways, lights flickering on and off with no one around. The maintenance team swore it was electrical issues, but nothing ever showed up on their diagnostics. The security footage would glitch for a few seconds at a time, just static and black screens. Then came the night of October 3rd. I remember the date because it was the first time I seriously considered quitting. The night began normal enough. I clocked in, poured myself a cup of burnt coffee, and started my rounds. I passed through the east wing first, where the assembly lines were. The machines sat cold and silent, each one draped in its own long shadow under the dim security lights. As I walked, my flashlight beam bounced off the shiny metal and empty workstations. I checked the time, 11:23 p.m., then made my way toward the loading docks. The air there was colder somehow. The massive garage doors creaked in the wind, metal groaning like something alive. I scanned the area, nothing out of the ordinary. When I returned to the security office, I noticed one of the camera feeds had frozen. Camera 12, which covered the western corridor leading to the old boiler room. That area hadn't been used in years. The company had shut it down after an accident back in 1989, a small explosion caused by a gas leak. 2 men were killed. I toggled the feed a few times, but it wouldn't reset. The image stayed still, frozen on a view of the dimly lit hallway. For a moment, I thought I saw something in the corner of the frame, a shadow or a figure, but when I leaned closer, it was gone. I sighed, rubbed my eyes, and decided to go check it out myself. The western corridor was colder than the rest of the building. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of burnt oil still lingered faintly. My flashlight cut through the gloom, revealing long-forgotten equipment and rusted pipes. I could hear the echo of my footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. As I approached the old boiler room, the door creaked slightly open. That made no sense. I checked it earlier, and it had been shut tight. I nudged it open with the end of my flashlight and peered inside. The room was pitch black except for a sliver of light spilling from the hallway. Inside were the remains of old machinery, massive, rusting boilers, thick pipes running along the ceiling, and a few empty barrels stacked against the wall. And then I heard it, a faint metallic clank like someone tapping a wrench against steel. Once, twice, then silence. Hello? I called out, voice echoing. Anyone in here? Nothing. I took a few cautious steps inside, scanning the room. My flashlight caught something glinting on the far wall, a piece of metal, maybe. As I got closer, I realized it was an old nameplate, half hanging off the wall. It read, Maintenance Supervisor D. Miller. That name hit me like a punch. One of the men killed in the explosion back in '89 was named Daniel Miller. I remembered reading it in the company file. The tapping sound came again, louder this time behind me. I spun around, flashlight shaking. There was no one there. I started backing toward the door when I heard a slow creak of metal, like something shifting under its own weight. Then a breath, a real audible exhale that wasn't mine. I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the control room again. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely type the incident report. I switched to camera 12, half expecting it to still be frozen, but it wasn't. The feed was back, except now there was something on the screen. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway outside the boiler room. It was tall, its face obscured by darkness, but the shape of it was human, or close enough. I blinked, leaned in closer. The figure didn't move. Tom, you seeing this? I radioed my partner. He worked the north sector of the plant. Seeing what? Check camera 12, I said, voice shaking. I am. There's nothing there. I froze. You don't see the figure at the end of the hall? He paused for a long time. No, man, it's clear. I looked back at the monitor. The figure was still there, unmoving, its head tilted slightly toward the camera. My stomach turned. I watched it for a full minute before it finally started to move, slowly, deliberately, toward the lens. I stood up, knocking over my coffee. Tom, it's moving. But the radio went dead, just static. I reached for my sidearm, though part of me knew it wouldn't do much good. The building lights flickered. One by one, the monitors blinked out until only camera 12 remained on. The figure was closer now. I could make out more details. The face was wrong, stretched somehow, the skin pale and blistered like it had been burned. The eyes looked hollow, just dark sockets staring straight into the camera. The lights went completely dark. The only glow came from the monitors, their pale blue hue lighting up the room. I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside, slow and dragging, coming toward the office. My heart hammered against my ribs. I aimed my flashlight at the door. The footsteps stopped, then the handle rattled, once, twice, then slowly it started to turn. I stepped back, gun shaking in my hands. This is private property, I shouted. Whoever you are, step away from the door. The handle kept turning. Then it stopped. Silence. I stood there frozen, waiting for something to happen. After what felt like an eternity, I worked up the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but on the floor just outside the door were wet footprints. Bare, human footprints, leading down the hall toward the western corridor. I followed them, heart pounding. The tracks led all the way back to the boiler room door, which was now closed tight again. I pushed it open. The room was empty. The footprints ended in the middle of the floor. I stood there, flashlight trembling, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed the wall. Someone or something had drawn on it. Written in the dust and grime were the words, "Still here." I stumbled backward, tripping over a loose pipe. My flashlight flickered, and for a split second I saw something reflected in the metal surface beside me. A man's face, burned and blistered, staring right at me. I screamed and ran, not stopping until I reached the parking lot. I sat in my car, shaking until sunrise. The next morning I told my supervisor everything. He looked at me with his half-sympathetic, half-knowing expression. Then he said quietly, "You're not the first one." Apparently, every few years, new guards reported strange things in the western corridor. Some claimed to see a man in burned clothing, others heard the tapping or breathing sounds. The company brushed it off as superstition, said the stories kept the younger guards alert. I quit that same day. 2 months later, one of my old coworkers called me. He sounded shaken, said he was working the night shift when he noticed something strange on camera 12, a figure standing at the end of the hallway. He said it looked like a man, burned and blistered. He quit the next day too. It's been years since then, but I still dream about that building. In the dreams, I'm back in the corridor, the lights flickering, the tapping sound echoing in the dark. I always turn, and there's someone behind me. Burned skin, hollow eyes, whispering through blackened lips. You shouldn't have opened the door. I always wake up before he reaches me. But sometimes when I wake up, the smell of burnt oil still lingers in the air, and I swear I hear that faint tapping sound somewhere in the room. Story the end. It started on a Friday night, the kind where the wind cuts through the city streets and leaves a chill that you can feel straight down to your bones. I'd been working as a security guard for nearly 6 years, mostly in office buildings and small corporate complexes, so the late night solo shifts were nothing new. But that Friday was different, and I wouldn't realize it until much later. The building I was assigned to was a sprawling industrial complex on the outskirts of Detroit. By day, it was buzzing with employees, forklifts moving pallets, and the constant hum of machines. By night, though, it was dead silent, the fluorescent lights flickering in some corners, leaving shadows that seemed a little too deep, a little too alive. I'd done a walkthrough of the facility before, multiple times, so I knew every hallway, every storage room, every emergency exit, or so I thought. I clocked in at 7 p.m., grabbed my flashlight and walkie-talkie, and headed straight for the security office. The place was basic, a small room with monitors for the security cameras, a couple of desks, and a worn-out couch that had seen better decades. I settled in, logging onto the surveillance system, checking the cameras one by one. Everything seemed normal. The empty hallways stretched out in perfect symmetry, crates stacked neatly in storage areas, nothing out of place. About an hour in, I started my rounds. The routine was simple. Check the main entrances, the storage areas, the loading docks, and make sure all security doors were locked. As I moved through the facility, the silence was almost suffocating. Every step echoed through the concrete hallways, the sound bouncing off the high ceilings. I reached the loading dock and shined my flashlight across the empty parking lot. No cars, no movement, just the wind whispering through the chain-link fence. I walked back inside, and that's when I first noticed it, a faint sound coming from the far end of the warehouse. At first, I thought it was just the old building settling, maybe a loose panel or a pipe contracting, but the sound persisted, a slow, deliberate tapping, like someone knocking on metal. I froze, listening. The sound was rhythmic, methodical. I called in on the radio to my supervisor, a guy named Tom. "Hey, Tom, you hear anything?" There was a pause. "I don't hear anything on my end," he said. "You probably just caught the building. Those pipes make some weird noises at night." I nodded, forcing calm. Maybe it was just the building. I moved cautiously down the hallway toward the sound, flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, the tapping stopped. I stopped too, heart racing. The silence after the noise was worse than the noise itself. I scanned the area with my flashlight, slowly moving it over the stacks of crates and pallets. Nothing. Shrugging it off, I continued my rounds. The rest of the shift passed in an uneasy blur, my nerves on edge. Every creak, every gust of wind made me tense. I checked the security monitors frequently, my eyes darting from one feed to another. That's when I saw it, something on the camera in the south storage wing. A shadow moving across the far corner. I zoomed in. Empty. Nothing there. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The shadow seemed to have shifted, though I knew no one had entered that area. I called Tom again. "You seeing anything in the south wing?" I asked. "Nothing, man. Cameras are all clear. You getting tired?" he replied. I told him maybe, trying to convince myself. Still, an uneasy feeling settled in my stomach. I finished my rounds and returned to the security office around midnight. I sat down trying to keep calm, listening to the hum of the monitors and the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights. Then it started. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from the hallway outside the office. I grabbed my radio. "Tom, I think someone's in the building." "Are you sure?" he asked. "Yes, I'm sure." "Call the cops if you need to, but don't leave the office," he said. I nodded, heart hammering. The footsteps grew louder, stopping just outside the door. I shined my flashlight toward the peephole, but nothing was there. The radio crackled, a faint static whispering through it, then a voice low and distorted like it was coming through a warped speaker. "Why are you here?" I froze, staring at the door. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. No response. The footsteps resumed, moving away down the hallway. I grabbed my phone, considered calling the police, but the signal was weak in that part of the building. I told Tom again, describing what happened. He told me to stay put, that he'd call the local precinct, but I wasn't sure I wanted anyone else coming in just yet. I needed to see. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back toward the south wing, the place where I'd seen the shadow on the camera. Every step felt heavier, like the building itself was pressing down on me. When I reached the south wing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. One of the storage doors, normally locked and secured, was wide open. I knew I hadn't unlocked it. The darkness inside seemed to pull at me, almost alive. I hesitated, then shined my flashlight in. Nothing. Just rows of shelves, crates, and dusty machinery. I stepped inside, the flashlight beam cutting across the shadows. That's when I saw it, scratches, deep and jagged, running along the floor, leading further into the darkness. They weren't recent scratches. Old, maybe. But they weren't here the last time I had checked. My heart pounded. I followed the scratches cautiously, flashlight trembling in my hand. The deeper I went, the colder it got, the air thick with a metallic scent I couldn't place. Then I heard it. A whisper, faint, coming from the far corner. I froze. "You shouldn't be here," it said. I spun around, shining my flashlight everywhere. Nothing. Just crates and the endless shadows. I backed out slowly, realizing I was completely alone. When I reached the door, it slammed shut behind me. I ran back to the security office, heart hammering, nearly tripping over the floor. I locked the door, checked the monitors. Nothing. The south wing camera feed was black, static. I called Tom again, voice shaking. "The south wing camera's down. I think someone's in there for real this time." "Stay in the office. Don't leave. I'm calling the cops," he said. I waited, but the silence was oppressive. Then came a sound that made me wish I'd left the building that night. Scratching? Coming from the walls themselves, circling the office. I grabbed my flashlight and radio, shining it around. Nothing. The scratching grew louder, as if something or someone was trying to get in. Then the door handle rattled. I jumped back, fumbling with the lock. The handle twisted violently, shaking the door. I grabbed the nearest object, a metal fire extinguisher, and held it ready. The door stopped moving. Silence. Minutes passed. The scratching had stopped. My ears strained for any sound. Then, faintly, from the monitors, I saw movement. A figure, standing still in the south wing, watching me through the camera. But the image was grainy, distorted, and the figure didn't move like a person. Its limbs were wrong, too long, too angular, its head tilting at impossible angles. I screamed into the radio. "Tom, there's someone, or something, on the cameras." "I don't see anything." "Are you seeing things?" I didn't know if I was, but I knew what I saw. I grabbed my flashlight, bolted from the office, heading for the south wing again. I had to confront it, had to see if it was real. Every step I took, the shadows seemed to grow, stretching toward me, trying to pull me in. When I reached the corner where the figure had appeared, the flashlight flickered and died. Total darkness swallowed me. I fumbled, banging the flashlight against my palm. Then, a voice, right in my ear, cold and hollow. "You shouldn't have come back." I spun, swinging the flashlight. Nothing. Just the darkness, pressing in from all sides. I ran blindly, tripping over crates, my hands scraping against metal shelves. I didn't stop until I reached the office. I locked the door, breathing heavily, soaked in sweat. I didn't move. I didn't check the monitors. I just waited, listening. Hours passed. The wind outside moaned through the broken windows, the faint creaks of the building settling, or something else, echoing in the halls. At dawn, when the first light filtered through the grimy windows, I dared to look. The south wing camera feed was back. Normal. Empty. Nothing had been there. The scratches on the floor were gone. The doors were locked. I never went back that night. I quit the job the next day, leaving all my gear behind. Some part of me wants to believe it was exhaustion, paranoia, some trick of shadows and stress. But the thing is, I wasn't alone that night. I know what I saw, what I heard, and I know that building is still there, empty, waiting for someone else to make the mistake I did. I still get calls sometimes from other security guards. They talk about strange noises, shadows in the cameras, doors that lock themselves. I warn them, but they don't always listen. Some things you don't want to see and some places you don't want to be alone in. That building is one of them. I've moved on, taken a different job now, something with people around, daylight, noise. But sometimes when the wind howls just right, I swear I can hear footsteps echoing in the dark, calling me back to that south wing, waiting for me to make one wrong step again. Story the end. When I took the overnight security job at the old Fairview Medical Center, I didn't expect anything more than long, quiet nights, and a decent paycheck. The hospital had been shut down for over a decade after the county built a new facility across town. What remained of Fairview was a decaying shell, cracked walls, peeling paint, and an air of forgotten stories. The place was slated for demolition, but until then, the city wanted round-the-clock surveillance to keep vandals, squatters, and thrill-seekers out. I started my first shift on a cold January night. The wind howled through the broken windows as I parked my car behind the main building. The security office was a small, makeshift room set up in what used to be a nurse's break area. Inside, there was an old desk, a landline phone, a coffee maker that looked older than me, and a wall of monitors that displayed flickering camera feeds from various wings of the hospital. My supervisor, a grizzled guy named Daniels, was finishing up his shift when I arrived. He gave me a half smile and a nod. "New guy, huh?" "Yeah, Matt Harris." He handed me a flashlight and a binder thick with handwritten notes. "All right, Harris, here's the deal. Most nights are dead quiet, but you might hear things. Pipes clanging, rats running around. Don't freak out. Just do your patrols, watch the feeds, and don't wander into the psych wing." I frowned. "Why not the psych wing?" He didn't look up from packing his bag. "It's unstable, roof leaks, floor's soft, and just don't. Some of the guys swear they've heard things there. Voices. Movement." I chuckled nervously, waiting for him to laugh. He didn't. He just patted me on the shoulder and said, "You'll see what I mean. Stay safe." That first night was boring. I walked the halls with my flashlight, checking doors and windows. The building had that peculiar hospital smell, disinfectant and mold, and every sound echoed too long in the empty corridors. The cameras flickered occasionally, and once or twice I thought I heard faint footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing. By the end of the first week, I'd gotten used to the silence. I'd bring coffee, scroll through my phone, and count down the hours until sunrise. But then small things started happening. Barely noticeable at first. The elevator on the east wing would move on its own. The lights in the main hallway would flicker, sometimes staying off for minutes at a time. And every so often, I'd see what looked like movement on the monitors. One night, around 3 a.m., I was watching the feeds when I noticed something strange. Camera 12, which faced the psych wing entrance, showed a figure standing just inside the doorway. It wasn't clear, more like a dark blur than a person, but it was definitely there. I switched to another angle, and the hallway was empty. I switched back, gone. I sat there for a minute, my pulse racing, before convincing myself it was just static interference. The next night, I heard it. I was doing my rounds, walking past the psych wing door, when I heard a faint tapping sound, like knuckles against glass. I stopped, flashlight shaking slightly, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. Then, silence. I called out, "Anyone there?" My voice echoed down the hallway. No response. I stepped closer to the door. The tapping came again, louder this time, more urgent. I reached for the handle, but it was ice cold, like metal that had been sitting in a freezer. I pulled back instinctively and stepped away. When I got back to the office, I checked the psych wing camera again. This time, there was no blur, just darkness. But as I stared, something caught my eye. A shadow moved across the far end of the hall. I blinked, leaning closer. The shape stopped. Then, slowly, it turned toward the camera. It looked human, but wrong. Too tall, the limbs too long, the head tilted slightly, like it was looking at me. I jumped back from the screen, my breath quickening. When I looked again, the feed had gone to static. I reported it in my log, but the next morning, Daniels brushed it off. "Bad wiring," he said. "That whole section's a mess. Don't waste your time worrying about it." Still, I couldn't shake it. Over the next few weeks, the activity grew worse. I'd hear whispering in the hallways, soft, distant voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Doors would slam shut behind me, even when there was no draft. Once, I found wet footprints leading from the psych wing down the main hall, barefoot prints that stopped right in front of my office door. I started to dread my shifts. Every night felt heavier than the last, the air colder. I barely slept during the day, and when I did, I dreamed of the hospital, of long corridors that stretched forever and rooms filled with whispers. The breaking point came one Friday night in February. A storm was raging outside, wind howling through the broken windows, rain pelting against the glass. Around 2:30 a.m., the power flickered. The lights dimmed and all the monitors went black except one. Camera 12, the psych wing. The figure was back, this time clear as day. A man in a hospital gown standing in the middle of the hallway. His head hung low, his arms dangling at his sides. I froze, staring. Then he started walking toward the camera, slowly, deliberately. I grabbed the radio. "Dispatch, this is Harris at Fairview. I've got a possible intruder in the psych wing." Static. No response. "Dispatch, do you copy?" Nothing. Just the crackle of dead air. I grabbed my flashlight and hesitated at the door. I knew I shouldn't go near that wing, but something in me needed to see it with my own eyes. Maybe it was adrenaline. Maybe stupidity. Either way, I walked. The hallways were darker than usual, the emergency lights casting long shadows across the walls. When I reached the psych wing door, I could hear something faint. Music. A lullaby. Off-key, distorted, like it was playing from an old radio underwater. I pushed the door open, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The hallway beyond was empty, but the air was freezing. My breath fogged in front of me. I stepped inside. The music grew louder, echoing off the walls. I followed it down the corridor until I reached one of the old patient rooms. The door was slightly open, and light flickered from inside. I pushed it open. Inside, the room looked untouched by time. Bed neatly made, IV stand upright, a rocking chair by the window gently moving back and forth. But there was no wind. My flashlight flickered. I stepped closer to the bed and saw something on the wall above it, written in what looked like rust or blood. "Stay with me." I stumbled backward, heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind me. The rocking chair stopped moving. Then from behind me, a voice whispered, right next to my ear, "You came back." I spun around, flashlight shaking. Nothing. The air felt thick, hard to breathe. I grabbed the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. I started kicking it, slamming my shoulder into it until finally it gave way. I sprinted back down the hall, not daring to look back. But I could hear footsteps following me. Slow, dragging, getting closer. I burst back into the main corridor and didn't stop running until I reached the security office. I slammed the door, locked it, and collapsed into the chair, gasping for air. The monitors flickered back on, and on every single one of them, the psych wing hallway, the lobby, the stairwells, I saw the same figure. The man in the hospital gown, standing perfectly still, head tilted toward the cameras. I called the police again. This time, they arrived around 4:10 a.m. 2 officers swept the building while I waited outside in the rain. They found no one, not a single trace. The only thing they mentioned was that one of the rooms in the psych wing had the words, "Stay with me," scratched into the wall. They assumed vandals. I quit the next morning. I didn't even go back for my last paycheck. That was 6 months ago, and I still dream about Fairview. Sometimes I hear the lullaby in my sleep, faint and distant like it's coming from another room. Once I woke up and swore I saw a figure standing in the corner of my bedroom, just watching. When I turned on the light, it was gone. But the faint smell of antiseptic lingered in the air. I drive past the old hospital sometimes. It's still standing, though most of the windows are boarded up now. The city hasn't demolished it yet. Every time I pass, I see something or someone in the upper floor window, staring out at the road. I know what I saw in that building. I know what I heard. And I know that whatever haunts Fairview didn't want to be left alone. Story the end.